Welcome to today's program titled Strategic Approaches for Conducting DEIB Reviews. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the program by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, a CLE attendance verification code will be read later in the presentation. Please write this code down as it will not be reread and is required on the CLE credit request form. During the presentation, you will see a slide with a QR code that you may scan to access and submit your request for CLE credit. You can also find a link to the form in the connection details email you received this morning. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to all attendees in the days following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. This presentation has been prepared by Seyfarth Shaw LLP for informational purposes only. The material discussed during this webinar should not be construed as legal advice or a legal opinion on any specific facts or circumstances. The content is intended for general information purposes only, and you are urged to consult a lawyer concerning your own situation and any specific legal questions you may have. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker for today's program, Christy Kiley. Christy, please go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Donna. Yeah, Brendan and I are really happy to be here with everybody. These virtual presentations make it easy for him to be in Chicago and myself to be outside DC. So good to have everyone. This is our second DEI micro webinar series. Annette Timon in the series. Annette Timon and I kicked it off a couple weeks ago, and I will say half an hour flies by, but we can fit a lot of information into that time period, and that's our hope here today. And as Annette said in that session, our goal is really to make this useful to all of you. Your time is valuable. We want to have some educational pieces, but also some practical takeaways. So hopefully we'll be hitting on both of those as we go through. Let's touch on the next slide real quickly. I'm just going to tee up and highlight for you what we're going to be talking about. And then we also have a list of the upcoming sessions remaining in our webinar series. So we're doing the intro now, of course. I'm then going to turn it over to Brandon, who's going to talk to you about why DEIB reviews remain so important. We are a year out from fair admissions at this point. It's hard to believe, but they remain as important as ever. The stages that process has as a practical sort of nuts and bolts matter. What do you go through in that process? And then I'm going to pivot to talking about some of the scenarios that Brandon and I have dealt with in working with clients, some of the key questions that arise, steps that need to be taken, and walk all of you through that. And then we'll just come back together and wrap things up. And as I said, go through those different sessions that will be made available to you. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to turn it right over to you, Brandon. Wonderful. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Wait, we're doing the description. I saw that at the end too. So let's go to the next slide and do the, there, here we go. This is what I was thinking of. So this is the description of just the series we're going to be talking about. So we don't have all of these calendared yet because we are trying to space them out every few weeks to make them, accessible to all of you. As I said, we did the first one a couple weeks ago in the middle of May. Today we're doing DEIB reviews, but do take a second and just scan through this list because we put a lot of time into, again, putting ourselves in your shoes and trying to think from a company and an employer's perspective, what is most useful and the most pressing inquiries at this time. So there's a lot of good stuff in here, including AI, which everybody is talking about these days, and it does impact DEIB as well. So just stay tuned for all of these. June 19th and July 9th are the two dates you could go ahead and calendar if you were interested. Okay. And now we go to the next slide. And now I will turn it over to you, Brendan.
Thank you, Christy. So as Christy mentioned, we wanted to start by just kind of giving you an overview of why we believe these are these sorts of reviews are important. And if we go to the next slide, please. If you've been to any of our webinars over the past year or so, this slide may look familiar in part because, I'll let you in on a secret. We are reusing some of these sometimes, and this one in particular is reused in part because we don't want to spend a lot of time. We have 30 minutes and we're moving quickly, and so I don't want to spend too much time going over students for fair admission, but that is in part the reason that we're all sitting here, right? Is in what sort of launched us having these webinars and this series as well. And so, you know, I'm sure most folks on the call are familiar with the ruling and, you know, and the fact that while it didn't have any direct implications for private employers in their DEI programming, it did sort of cause companies to start sort of looking inward and you know, there's been a lot of media coverage and spotlight on DEI. And so because of that, you know, if we can go to the next slide, because of that and sort of this concurring opinion that sort of makes it seem like, you know, it could be that we start seeing, you know, some cases, or maybe there's a case that makes it to the Supreme Court and ultimately does, you know, alter the way that we think about DEI and employment. You know, companies, I think, rightfully began, you know, sort of starting to think about their DEI program a little bit more. Next slide, please. As you can see here, again, here are some of the various pressure points on DEIB programming. Right, there's kind of the immediate response from the attorneys generals, both on you know, the Republican side and the Democratic side. You know, there's the EEOC statements on these issues. There's been, you know, we've observed and have been tracking, you know, a trend of increased reverse discrimination litigation and litigation that, you know, specifically references companies' DEI programming, and many of those quotes are coming from sort of public statements made about DEI. So there's no question that it is, you know, that there's been more pressure on these programming, you know, on this type of programming in the past year. Next slide, please. And here are some just recent headlines, right, of in the past couple of months about DEI. And so, again, it is something that is still in the news. And, you know, next slide, please. You can see that one way to respond to the increased scrutiny is to conduct the DEI review. You know, we initially, I think, you know, referred to them as DEI audits, and, you know, we got some feedback which we have implemented that, you know, that language, you know, may not be the best way to describe it. And so we, both Christy and I have conducted a number of these privileged DEI reviews. And it's helpful because, you know, without the spotlight that's been on DEI programming in the last, you know, year or so, folks may have become lax or not sort of been paying as close of attention to the legal aspects of a DEI program, right? You know, I think sometimes there's an assumption that, you know, we're trying to do good here. And I remember even before the Students for Fair Admission case, when we would, you know, we'd be advising on these issues, is that, you know, the overwhelming response would be, hey, you know, we're trying to do something good here. If you know, sort of a rogue employee wants to sue us because, you know, they didn't have access to a specific DEI programming, you know, a specific DEI program, you know, bring it on. We're willing to take it on because, you know, we think we're doing the right thing here. And because of that, you know, because there wasn't sort of this really bright spotlight on DEI, you know, programming may have sort of gotten to a point where, you know, it may have heightened, or it may have sort of have heightened risk at this point. And so, you know, the goal of a DEI review is really to kind of look at the programming that a company has, really sort of maybe streamline it and figure out, you know, where are the programs, how are they being run? Do we need all of these programs still? To update policies, to update communications, which, as I mentioned before, are big sort of risk area in terms of sort of drawing scrutiny and potential litigation, especially with public-facing statements. You know, having discussions with the C-suite, who is now more interested in this, about risk appetite and strategy in terms of DEI. And so this, you know, doing a DEI review, while time-consuming, is a good way to kind of do all of these things. Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to move into kind of a typical DEI review review cycle or process that we have done. Next slide. So this is, again, just kind of a general overview of the type of reviews that we've done and the steps we've used to conduct them, but the process may vary based on the company's goals. It may vary based on the size of the business. It may vary based on what I'll call the DEIB maturity of the business, right? If you're a company that doesn't have, or an organization that doesn't have a sort of robust DEI programming or DEI group, then some of these steps may not be necessary. But for some of our clients who have large DEI organizations, a more detailed look at it using kind of this framework might be helpful. So we usually start with a project kickoff. We always think it's great to have relevant stakeholders involved, whether it's kind of the head of DEI or HR, communications, the legal department. And us as outside reviewers to just talk about, generally what the goals are, sort of, kind of go through what our experience has been with these sorts of reviews, and start kind of asking questions about the nature of the company's DEI programming. It's also at that stage that we try to establish privilege, usually, via a memo explaining the purpose of the review and sort of the goals of it, and starting to define kind of that core group of individuals who is going to be involved in the process. Once we get the project team together, it's important to start identifying and gathering documents, which we'll talk about soon, is sometimes the hardest part of this process, right? Especially for large organizations and ones who are, as I mentioned earlier, sort of DEIB mature, right? It's finding documents which could be spread out among different different business units may have their own project or own DEI programming. There may be different DEI programming geographically around the country, and so really trying to get our arms around where should we be looking in the first place, and then trying to actually get those documents gathered is kind of a very kind of robust stage and can take weeks and weeks and weeks to do that. Then once we have that, or at least most of those documents ready to go, we usually like to prioritize, right? And a lot of our clients that we've done these for, we really look at the overall programming of the company and say, okay, let's look at the things that are highest risk first. Let's look at things that are public facing first, and any new programs or programs that are in development that you're hoping to launch in the next 3 months or the next month, right? We'll take a look at those first, and we may be less interested in things that at least are lower risk, right? And the risk that changes, right? It's changed in the last year, right? I think a year ago we would have said your DEI training, for example, is something that that's kind of lower priority for us, at least and we're looking at things more generally. But there's been a lot of litigation on DEI training, and so that might be something that moves up a little bit in the priority list. And so we're constantly monitoring that and thinking about sort of how do we do this in a way that makes sense. And then you may decide we're only going to focus on the high risk stuff here first, and we'll come back and look at the other stuff later. And so we kind of go through that process with you as well. If necessary, we conduct interviews, because it's while how a program is designed or what it sort of says on paper is one thing, but to talk to the folks who actually are implementing it, that's another. And so we often do find that while it may be designed one way, over the years it sort of evolved into something that may create more risk, or frankly sometimes something that may create less risk. And then finally we end with our sort of risk assessment and recommendations about the programming, as well as kind of talk through thoughts about how you might communicate these changes, and to whom you might communicate these changes. And with that, I will turn it over to Christy to sort of talk through some of the practical advice related to all of this.
Great, thanks, Brandon. Yeah, we're going to go ahead and dive in to some of the areas Brandon mentioned in a bit more detail, starting on this next slide here. And what we're trying to do here is highlight what we've found to be some of the most key steps and actions to have a successful DEIB review. And this first one might seem obvious to some of you, but it's to generate buy-in from the company, and in particular from its top levels of leadership. If you can say check the box and zone out for the next minute on this session, that's absolutely fine. But I know there are some companies that will need to spend some time on this. Brandon and I have seen some really interesting corporate dynamics around the DEI space. This is a topic that people have different opinions on and different understandings about, candidly. People envision different things in their mind when you talk about diversity programming. So it's really important to bring the key stakeholders together. And again, in particular, the people at the top. Your CEO should know about this audit. You should make sure that he or she cares about DEI and its priorities for the organization, that they understand how much the legal landscape is changing, as Brandon mentioned at the beginning. All of those things are absolutely essential, because otherwise what happens is you may recommend a change to something, or you may recommend just adjusting something here and there, and it seems to come out of the blue, and they don't understand why we're tweaking programs that may have been in place for years and years and years. Or perhaps they didn't even know about some of these initiatives. So getting everybody together at the beginning, it can be part of that project team step, and making sure that people are aligned. The last thing I'll say on this goes back to the point Brandon made about terminology. When we first drafted these slides, they actually said DEIB audits, because as attorneys, I think that's just sort of how we think about the process. But we have found that audit is a loaded term to businesses. And that's absolutely true once somebody pointed it out and I started to think about it. If you have been through an OFCCP audit, if you're in the financial sector and go through financial audits, that's a term with a capital A, and it has a very negative connotation for a lot of people and can put people on the defensive. That is not what this process is about. We are very supportive of DEI on an individual level, and very supportive of the legal framework that is still sort of encouraging DEI. This is just about making sure policies and programs are accomplishing their purpose while minimizing legal risk to the organization. So all of that is really important at the first step here, and generating buy-in and getting your project team together.
And I'll add to that, the phrase we often use is we're here to sort of help enable the work, right? I feel like I've said that phrase 1,000 times when we've been doing these, right? Because particularly generating buy-in sometimes from the DEI folks at a business, right, where they see these outside attorneys come in and their assumption is we're there to sort of stop, progress or to change programming. Like that's the goal of the company, or that there's an assumption that, oh, the fact that they're bringing in outside lawyers means that the company is afraid of what's going on, and so they're sort of being cowards about dealing in. And so sort of setting expectations and level setting and saying, no, that's not why we brought in outside attorneys. It is not to sort of come in and tell us we can't do things anymore. And so I think it's always helpful for us to kind of introduce ourselves in the way that Christy just described, which is like, we care about this stuff too, and we're here to help enable you do the work.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Thank you. On the next slide, we're going to talk about another important issue, which is just finding what it is you are going to be reviewing. Another one that is harder perhaps than it sounds. We have seen really the full gamut from clients on this. Some of them come to us with this just giant library of DEI resources, and they say, this is our diversity catalog, here you go. That's fantastic. Others come to us and say, we know we care about diversity, we know we have things out there, but we don't know exactly what they are. Our EEO policy, sure, maybe this program is clear, but there are managers out in the field, or there are offices that have their own plans, or whatever it might be. And those things that are out there need to be brought into the fold of the review, so that you're looking at the entirety of things that the company would be responsible for were there to be a challenge of some kind. So we spend a fair amount of time on this if a company is not already with sort of that nicely boxed in diversity catalog to start from. And there's a couple of places that you can note where you want to start looking. And they're both internal and external. That's important to note, because as Brandon mentioned, what a lot of these, we call them DEI detractors, right? Or critics, folks trying to come after DEI. What the advocacy groups do is they go out and search for key terms, right? And so they are looking at your websites, they're looking at your DEI pages, They're looking at your 10K filings and your ESG reports and things like that. So you do want to make sure you're including things that are external and publicly available, and just making sure that their terminology is as you would want it to be. Then you go internally, obviously, which is where you're going to have the meat and the greater level of detail. And there's sort of themes to what we find most useful to look for there. One, of course, is just formal policies and procedures. There usually is something, formal and in writing with regard to diversity, whether it's a DEI policy in its entirety, or whether it's something that touches on a particular initiative. A company might have a diversity mentoring program and have a policy on that. They might have ERGs are part of a DEIB review. So maybe they have descriptions of the ERGs and the criteria that are allowed to use to form an ERG. That's a policy we might look at. Some companies have diverse slates, which we are going to talk about in future sessions, I assure you, because that is a really interesting topic for DEI. But so policies and procedures is one area. And then programs are not always manifested that way, right? So there are other programs that have either developed informally over time and sort of grown and expanded, or maybe they are captured by something other than a policy or procedure, right? There might be a guidebook for managers in terms of what to do for a given program. There might be a series of training that is reflected in PowerPoint slides, and you need to go through the training and look at those. We typically say anything that touches on DEI within your organization that has not been reviewed since the fair admissions decision should be swept in and part of this review. Some of it's very quick to look at and you can move on, but it should be something that people are putting eyes on. Dashboards and metrics and sort of trends and forecasting, any of that has to do with DEI. You need to look at how that data is collected, how it's maintained, who is given access to that data, the privilege component. So data and metrics is another area. And sometimes you have to go to multiple departments for that, like an HRIS or a diversity recruiting department. Speaking of departments, those that typically have materials related to this, of course, HR. If you have a standalone diversity and inclusion office, of course, they are going to probably be spearheading this process and have a lot for you. But then we find there are very often important initiatives in recruiting or talent acquisition, whichever you call it in your organization. Talent development for existing and incumbent employees very often have a diversity component. Employee relations, your policies, non-harassment, non-discrimination, all of that. Compensation. Some companies do have compensation-based metrics tied to DEI efforts. We've talked about that in our webinars. It's probably one of the higher risk components to tie diversity progress to incentives and compensation. But you need to look and figure out if you have that before you can find out if you have risks. So the comp department is another place we typically go. Benefits, legal, compliance, all of those things. I actually prepared this sort of a survey that we give out to clients to help them talk to folks out again in the field or different offices or locations. Because if you say, do you have any DEI programs, you may get back a lot of very quick no's, because people don't always think about things in terms of a quote unquote DEI program, and yet that may still be exactly what they are in practice and in reality. So you want to be framing the questions to your folks a little bit more generally. Not just whether it specifically references DEI, but does it relate to diversity? Does it support diversity? Does it have a diversity component? Are you tracking diversity representation or numbers for any reason? Just different things like that. So think expansively, use general language and make sure you're collecting all of this information. Let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about what you do once you have all of that. The scope of a review is going to vary based on a couple of things, as Brandon alluded to when he was walking through the process. It's going to depend, one, on frankly, how much DEI has been incorporated into your corporate culture in recent years, how ingrained all of this is, how much you are already living and breathing your DEI programs on a day-to-day basis. Because when that's the situation, we find that clients can very often point to program A, B, and C and say, these are the ones we want you to focus on. These are the ones where we have some concern that the landscape may have changed. These other ones we're very comfortable with. We don't need to look at those as part of this review. That's fine. We're not saying the lawyers have to spend time looking at everything. If you know that you have particular initiatives like a diverse slate policy, you can highlight those and focus on those. Other clients want the holistic, comprehensive, we want to be comfortable with everything in our DEI arsenal. We're going to look at all of it. And you just really need to decide what works for the organization. Of course, manpower, staffing, and budget always come into these business decisions. We have done reviews that take not just weeks, but months because of both the quantity of material and because the company just has other priorities it's juggling at the time. So maybe a phased review makes more sense, tackle programs of the greatest concern and then circle back to the rest. But whichever approach you take, it's just important to be clear about it at the outset. So you know when you've hit the point of providing feedback and discussing findings and so forth, and when you know that the project is done. Okay. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so you've made it through this process, right? You've done all the steps we described so far, and in a privileged way, so that you can be candid and really, look under the hood, kick the tires. What do you do now with the results of the DEI? So let's go ahead and talk about what that review can yield in terms of outcomes on the next slide. I'm sorry, it does take a couple seconds to transition slides sometimes. So, okay. So we at Seyfarth, we try to provide a very user-friendly sort of report card to the client at the end of a DEIB review. There is almost always a long legal memo because we have to go into detail to really talk about some of the nuances. Some of what we do is forecasting what risk might be based on where the trend in litigation is going. Things like that take time to explain. But companies doing this work, they need something they can go to so they know if they have problems, so they know where to focus very quickly, so they know what to report to their bosses as areas that are or are not of concern. And so this is just a risk chart. We have a number of different variations of these floating out there. But it uses a color coding system, the old traffic system, which I like. And it goes from green programs, which are very low risk. You can continue those with no concern, works up to red where it's moderate high. And what a result typically will do is explain what those codes mean, as this chart does. And then it will slot the company's DEI initiatives into each category based on the assessment. So it will identify the programs that are red and need attention immediately. It will identify those that are yellow and probably should be looked at soon. So let's go to the next slide and we'll start wrapping this up here.
And I'm happy to take this, Christy.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, we get through the review and this is kind of the goal in terms of what we want, the conversation to be sort of internally, and we can be a part of these conversations as outside attorneys, but really to kind of give you the results and then, have you be able to have candid conversations about risk tolerance, sort of which programs are we willing to sort of take the risk on and continue as is, and which ones do we maybe want to dial some things back. Program changes, right? Similarly, like, do we want to make updates to these things? Do we want to, are we going to change the language in the way that, that Seyfarth suggested, or are we going to sort of leave things as is and again, sort of take on that risk because it's, it's only medium risk, for example. New processes, right? So now, this is a good time, like we said, to have these different stakeholders all in the same room discussing all of these programs that they may have not done in years. And so, hey, do we want to make sure legal is reviewing these specific types of things? If it has anything to do with the diverse slate, legal has to be involved. If it's something about training, that's less risky. And so, the DEI folks can sort of move forward without kind of having legal involved in the process. Privilege, right? Making sure that everyone understands how to do some of these things under privilege has been a big sort of teaching moment for us when we've sort of done readouts for these reviews. And then communicating results, right? Who are we going to communicate that we've done this review and sort of what some of the results are, if anyone, right? And so sometimes your ERG leaders might want to be sort of keyed in on this. And so do we want to have a version of this final report that we sort of read out to them and explain to them, hey, we did this process, here's what we found. We just want to let you know how this is important for us. Or is it, hey, this is just something that we're going to sort of keep internal and keep moving forward and working on, and not sort of kind of broadcast it. Next slide, please.
And I would just add, Brandon, that what we've been seeing, very, very rarely do we recommend the complete elimination of a program. It's much more about refining language or criteria or things like that. Oh, yep. Okay. You want to wrap us up here?
Yeah. So, next slide, please.
We have to get them the all-important CLE code.
Right.
So,
as in conclusion, I think our thought is, this is a good time to consider doing a DEIB review, and if we can tailor it to your sort of needs and sort of what's important to you. As we noted, they help assess legal risks. They help sort of find and catalog your organization's programming, provide benchmarking data for you, and also demonstrate a commitment to DEIB values. The fact that you're going through this process shows that it is something that is important to the company. Next slide. Here's just an overview of some of the upcoming programs that we have that Christy discussed earlier. Next slide. The all-important CLE code. So if you want to take some time to get your phone out, you can scan the QR code, and I will also read the the CLE code, which is SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 6741. That's SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 6741.
thanks everybody for your time.